diagram from the book which talks about this, the way in which it's called panarchy. It's this term that has been used by ecologists who study the ways in which ecosystems rise and fall. And you can see that sort of at one point there's this kind of exponential curve up, and then where the ecosystem becomes highly efficient and highly interconnected. Of course, if you think about humans as an ecosystem, we've never been more connected than we are now. We get our news immediately, and information and money is flowing around the world almost instantaneously. We are the most connected we've ever been, and we're extremely efficient. We all have all these, cell phones, and we can do so much work at such a speed. We're so efficient, so connected, but we've lost resilience. And I think where we're going to go in the future is we're going to need to become more resilient, less connected, and less efficient. And I want to talk about another way to think about efficiency, because I think that we tend to think that, well, of course, it's good to be efficient. And I think there's a good efficiency and a bad efficiency. I mean, that I-35W bridge was efficient, but it collapsed. And so that's not the kind of efficiency we want. The kind of efficiency we want, I will argue, is the kind of efficiency that nature has, which is that nature is both extremely efficient. There's no waste in nature. Everything that's a byproduct of some process is waste for one plant becomes food for another. And so nature is extremely efficient, but it's also incredibly redundant. And so we need new terms to think about efficiency and redundancy, and these are the kinds of ideas that I want to show you in a minute have great relevance to the ways in which communities think about themselves. So that's a bit about sort of the depressing past and the kinds of things that we're encountering, these kind of collapses of these bubbles, these systems from the 20th century that we're going to have to kind of move through and get past. What about the next century? And I want to make an argument that the incredible change we're in right now is not just that we're in a new century, but we have come to the end of about a 400-year cycle that began with Gutenberg, began with movable type, began with the book. The book was not just a convenience for people. With it came literacy. With literacy came the Protestant Revolution, came the scientific revolution, came the industrial revolution, came the democratic revolutions. Almost everything in our life right now, in some sense, could be traced back to the invention of movable type, the change of media that happened 450 some years ago. That is how a change of media can have such a profound effect. We are now in one of these rare moments where we are going through another change of media, which is the idea that you can bring your cell phone, where it's in my pocket here, you can take out this device and access any library in the world. You can get, through the internet, information on almost anything through this little thing that you stick in your pocket. This is profound. This is amazing. This is something that is going to have the same kind of effect that Gutenberg's invention had. And we've already seen it, right? We've seen the effect of these devices on the music industry. Look at what iTunes has done to the music business. And look at what the internet has done to journalism, right? So those are the first two industries that are being affected by this. And I would argue that every industry will be affected by this. And every community will be affected by this. And so part of what Fargo needs to think about in 2030 is, what does your community do given the incredible potential of all of this change that's going on? I think the communities that understand the nature of this change and that utilize it will absolutely thrive. And so that's what I also want to spend a few minutes talking about. And what is the nature of this metaphor? I would argue it's the web. And by that I mean not just the internet, not just the World Wide Web that we now use to get information, but the idea that we used to have a metaphor about reality that came from Gutenberg and came from Descartes and others, that we used to think about the world as a machine. We used to think thought of the body as a machine. We used to think about the brain as a big computer. We used to take our cities and we would divide it up to be very efficient as systems. So we had transportation systems and we kept those separate from natural systems, and we had commercial areas and we had residential areas over here and industrial areas over here. We designed our cities, we designed our lives in a mechanistic metaphor. That was what we did up through the 20th century. And we are now not only in a new century, we're in a new metaphor. Because once you recognize that the new metaphor is a web-like metaphor, it changes almost everything. First of all, the web is the way in which nature is organized. We now recognize that ecologies are essentially interconnected webs of species that are not only competing but also interdependent and cooperative. One of the biggest changes from the 20th century to the 21st century is we now recognize that nature is not survival of the fittest. It's an incredibly cooperative web of species. And either we join that web of species and start cooperating with nature, or we're going to be left out. And being left out of nature is not a good idea, and we can talk a bit about why that is. But one of the other things is this about the web is that it recognizes that a lot of the things that we've built our world upon aren't working for us anymore. The idea of separating things into hierarchies. You talk to organizations now, you talk to CEOs, or you go to a university, they'll tell you that the hierarchies are more and more meaningless. In a way where power lies now isn't so much where you are in a hierarchy, but how many people you're connected to. How strong is your web? So we now no longer think about as this metaphor, we no longer think about the brain as a big computer, we think about it as a neural network. Everything is about networks. We no longer think about society as a set of disparate classes and different activities. We now think about it as social networks. And so everything is about webs and about networks, and I would argue that that's a way to think about the future of a community like Fargo, is how can we strengthen the web of relationships, the connections among people? How can we maximize not their separation in a kind of mechanistic metaphor, but how do we make it as rich and diverse an ecosystem of people and ideas as possible? Those will be the communities that will thrive, just as those are the characteristics of a thriving ecosystem. So, of course, so here you go, you know. I had my tech guy who used to live in Fargo-Moorhead come in one day with an iPad, sit here, I want you to use this. I said, oh, no, I don't need to use this. Of course, I immediately recognized after I started using it, I mean, this thing is incredible. I mean, it has like transformed my ability to work, my ability to connect to people. And so these devices are important not just because they're kind of neat and well-designed objects, but because they allow us to do things in new ways and interact in new ways. And this idea, as I said, this notion that the human ecosystem needs to become much more like the natural ecosystem of which we are a part, which is that it is much more about interrelated webs. So I just wanted to sort of, you know, introduce those two ideas, that we're leaving a series of centuries that have thought about the world as machines, have thought about ourselves as machines, have organized society in mechanistic ways, and we have moved into a century that thinks about us more as along web-like ways, biological metaphors, ecological metaphors, where it's all about connectedness and cooperation. So now I just want to talk about what this means for Fargo, because I think all these ideas are only useful if they actually help you make decisions about where you go in the future. So, so what does this mean? Resiliency, these ideas mean that I think we have to look more to how natural systems work and build our cities and our communities around those same principles. I think one of the great in a way, mistakes humans made when we started to think about ourselves as machines, as we started to think about ourselves as separate from the natural world. We started to think about the natural world as something we could command and control. And of course, as we're realizing, that doesn't work. In the end, the natural world will command and control us, and it will keep doing it at greater and greater ferocity until we recognize that, it's probably smarter to work with nature rather than against it. Also, one of the things that I write about quite a bit is it's way too expensive to work against nature. I mean, we think that we can do this. I mean, one reason we are completely unsustainable in our debt levels and in the expense of all of what we do is we are working against all of nature. And so part of this is there's an economic argument here, is that this is not just wise, I would argue, to start to think about how we're connected and can learn from nature, but it's also economically very smart. How do we then connect communities as a set of social networks? How do we think about, in this case, Fargo as a web? And how do we maximize the connections among people? We have tended to privilege the idea of privacy. We all went to the suburbs, we all have our houses, and we all watch TV in our private family rooms, and we don't use the streets very much except to drive. And human communities before Gutenberg used the word privacy and privation have the same root word. It used to be that in Greek and Roman times, if you were being punished, you were given privacy. Privacy was to be exorcised from the city, to be sent out to the suburb, which was the place where you were sent to if you were being punished. And you were given privacy. People are generally social animals. We like to be with each other. And so I think one of the changes that's happening in this new web-like metaphor for reality is recognizing that we are actually happier being together than being apart. We're doing a project with a fellow named Dan Buettner who has written some books about blue zones. He's looked about why certain parts of the world are happier and healthier and live longer than other parts of the world. And it's amazing. His research has shown that, you go to, I think Sardinia is one place and Denmark is another, that these are people that have rich social lives. They have family and friends. They have lots of opportunities to connect. They have their privacy. Everyone needs a degree of privacy. But what they actually have much more of is a sense of purpose, less stress. And so humans know how to live well. And I think part of this is not just to do all of this thinking because we want to, compete. We want, in this case, Fargo to be the best city possible. We also want these places to be just great places to live where people are happy and healthy and vital and thriving. And so, so how do we use some of these ideas? So I thought I would just go through a set of principles. And the first of, as I was saying, is to let nature work for you. I had an interview this morning with an AM radio DJ from Fargo, and he was asking me about flooding. Of course, big issue here. And he said, "So what are we going to do? Put all our houses on stilts? We can't do that." And I said, "No, you don't need to do that. All we need to do is to handle flooding the way nature handles flooding, which is that nature creates a lot of sponges in the form of wetlands to handle whatever water conditions come its way." And so, I don't know how